Hello, my name is Octavian Gordon. I am from Romania and I currently teach at the University of Bucharest at the Department of Church History, Biblical Studies and Philology within the Faculty of Orthodox Theology. Upon invitation of the International Association of Patristic Studies, to whom I am being grateful for the opportunity to address this speech, I am proposing you a brief reading and analysis of Lactantius' account on soul, how he perceives and describes it. Now, this video is part of a series initiated by the International Association of Patristic Studies due to this unique situation we are experiencing in the coronavirus pandemic. In such a situation, our first instinct as human beings is to take security measures for ourselves, for our family, for our society, in order to save or preserve first our health and second our economy. But as the pandemic evolves, many of us being forced to live a life in separation from the others, step by step, we start thinking more and more of our spiritual life. This is why I welcomed the proposed subject for this video speech, namely Lactantius and soul care. I would like to remind you that Lactantius mainly lived and wrote under the great persecution of the 4th century initiated by Diocletian. Not a pandemic in a peaceful period, but a period of time when reflection on the spiritual life in general and on soul care in particular was a refuge for many. I would also like to add that for many of us, Christians or not, believers or not, the time being is a peaceful one, and yet there are regions of the world where religious persecution is still in progress and where Christians are even killed for their religion. Not to forget the recent horrible persecutions endured by Christians during the communist period in Eastern Europe and in all countries dominated by the Soviet regimes. The pandemic also revealed that the authorities can also interfere with the religious life by closing churches or other public worship places, by forbidding the Holy Communion, which is the core of the Christian faith and worship, or by formulating liturgical recommendations. This interference generated various reactions and, even more important, theological debates. Of course, theological debates should be left to theologians, but also common people started to reflect more and deeper on their spiritual life. Therefore, a Christian who for the first time in his life has the experience of participation in the resurrection feast of Christ, not in the church with the others, but from home in an online environment, automatically starts to reflect on what is formal and what is deeper than formal frames in his worship. This reflection, when superficial sociological terms are surpassed, leads step by step to reflections about who we are, where we come from, and where are we heading to. I have no intention to change the subject proposed with such a great generosity into a philosophical debate. With this introduction, I just wanted to point out the following. External constraints, such as a pandemic or a religious persecution, may bring sensitive people to a deeper reflection on essential life aspects, on life itself, and in particular on spiritual life. For Lactantius, the great persecution was such an external constraint, an opportunity for a theological reflection which brought to Christianity and to the world one of the greatest Latin early Christian literary masterworks. Inspired by this analogy, I was curious before revisiting the old texts of Lactantius to ask many of my friends and fellows what they think about soul. Many reacted like, what kind of question is that? Well, this is a simple question about something we often speak of and which has a special place in our Romanian language in different expressions. After a few more or less elaborated answers, I realized that it is very difficult for sensitive, educated people to have a clear idea on soul, which they themselves generally define as a part of the human being. With this perspective in mind, I started to read again Lactantius' fragments on soul and soul care. Of course, I had a methodological problem due to the equivalence of Latin words referring to soul and the modern language references to this notion. For example, in English, there has been a boycott of the term soul in the psychological literature. Here is what the Catholic Encyclopedia says. Whilst in German the word Seele has been in general accepted among psychologists, the great majority of English writers on mental life completely shun the use of the corresponding English word as seemingly perilous to their philosophical reputation. This is why sometimes in English the soul, as described by church fathers, has to be discovered under other terms like mind, heart, or even spirit. It is permitted to methodologically do so, as more as Roman languages show a meaning diversity in what Latin referred to as soul, mind, heart, etc. For example, Romanian inima means heart, whereas other descendants from Latin anima mean soul, fruit cores, nuts, or chestnuts. Moreover, in Albert Blaise's Latin-French Dictionary of Christian Authors, we can see how words like anima, animus, cor, mens, mentalis, and even spiritus have overlapping meanings in the unknown area of what we might consider today to be soul. Now, this issue may seem of little importance, as the way we approach the truth is not through words, but through facts of the reality. In the third book of his Divine Institutions, after arguing for the immortality of the soul, Lactantius says that divine learning does not stand in need of this, that is, in the branch of philosophy called logics, because the seat of wisdom is not the tongue, but the heart. And it makes no difference what kind of language you employ, for the question is not about words, but facts. This perspective reminds us of a whole series of Greek Christian writers, from Saint Gregory the Theologian and Saint John the Chrysostom to Saint Anastasius of Sinai and Saint Gregory Palamas, among others, who laid the foundation of the Christian gnoseology by literally saying that the truth doesn't consist in the way we name things, enonomacy and remasin, nor in writings and grammasin, but in things and pragmasin. This is as more important and more surprising as Lactantius is not a mystic. He is worldwide known as a learned person who tries to bring together the ancient wisdom and the Christian spirituality. He is a scholar, and he seeks arguments for his demonstrations in treatises or poems written by his pagan predecessors, Greek or Latin. That's why his restraint on the use of words is so remarkable. Res enim non verba quaeruntur. The first writing of Lactantius bears the title De Opificio Dei, on the workmanship of God, written around 304, a few years after his conversion to Christianity. This is a small treatise on the origin and nature of the human being, an attempt to reconcile the pagan anthropology with the Christian one. After a few considerations on the voice and on its incomprehensibility, Lactantius starts a discussion about the nature and the place of the mind, mens. He argues on its incomprehensibility as well, and even if the whole discussion is about mens, at the moment he rhetorically exclaims, "Can anyone fail to admire that living and heavenly faculty which is called the mind or the soul, qui mens vel animus non cupatur, is of such volubility?" In the same chapter, he speaks about the divina mens, which is everywhere diffused in the same way as the human mind is everywhere in the body. Nevertheless, He agrees that the mind could have its place in the head, but it doesn't remain there. For the mind, which exercises control over the body, appears to be placed in the highest part, the head, as God is in heaven. But when it is engaged in any reflection, it appears to pass to the breast and to withdraw to some secret recess, that it may elicit and draw forth counsel, as it were, from a hidden treasury. And he continues with arguments for how great God is in his creation, no matter whether the mind dwells in the head or in the body. The confusion continues in the next 2 chapters, where Lactantius speaks about the soul, which he merely refers to as anima, although it is not clear whether it is a different thing than animus. But what the soul is not yet agreed upon by philosophers, and perhaps will never be agreed upon. For some have said that it is blood, others that it is fire, others wind, from which it has received its name of anima or animus, because in Greek the wind is called anemos. Lactantius considers that the issue about the difference between anima and animus cannot be solved, although he makes a brief review of the opposite opinions, whether they are indeed different or they are the same thing. There are arguments for both sides, he says. But what strikes more is that he immediately changes the terms and starts to speak of mind instead of animus. To summarize, it is clear that Lactantius doesn't solve here the philosophical anthropological inquiry on soul, but some conclusions can be drawn. No matter how many phrases he allocates to different opinions on mens, animus, and anima, his main concern is to underline 2 things. First, the soul is immortal because it has its origin in God. And second, it is impossible to fully comprehend and express in words the nature of the soul. A third and shy conclusion could also be drawn. It is remarkable how Lactantius perceives some movements and characteristics of the mind which show compatibility with the Greek philocalic description of nous. We may agree that Lactantius's inconstancy in De Opificio Dei is due to his recent conversion to Christianity, as he writes a little after the great persecution upon Christians started. But the more we read about mens, anima or animus in his masterpiece, The Divine Institutions, we discover the same ambiguity in using these terms. In many places, although he explicitly says that every living creature consists of soul and body, ex anima et corpore, Lactantius opposes to the body the mind, the soul, both animus and anima, and the spirit, spiritus. He cites ancient philosophers and poets regarding a definition of God, who is mind, soul, or spirit, without being clear whether these descriptions are complementary or they simply are different terms referring to the same reality. For the human soul, he seems to prefer anima, as he does in the whole chapter 12 of the 2nd book of Divine Institutions. He is so clear when he says, "For having made the body, he breathed into it a soul from the vital source of his own spirit, which is everlasting, that it might bear the similitude of the world itself, which is composed of opposing elements. For he consists of soul and body, that is, as it were, of heaven and earth, since the soul by which we live has its origin as it were out of heaven from God, the body out of the earth, of the dust of which we have said that it was formed." But then he refers to anima as spiritus hic caeleste, this heavenly spirit, and immediately he changes terminology and refers to the same dominator of the body as animus. Maybe also because he starts quoting from Sallust, saying that we use the soul, animus, to command, the body rather to obey. In chapter 12 of the third book, Lactantius starts to indicate soul as animus. It is animus which has to fight against invisible enemies like lusts, vices, and sins. It is animus which will be unstained and pure if the virtue overcomes these enemies. In spite of his clear definition from the previous book, Lactantius says now that there are two parts of which man is made up, soul and body. Duo sunt ex quibus homo constat, animus et corpus. But in the same chapter, a few lines below, he speaks of animae as the pure and victorious souls, which after virtue has subdued the vices and the desires from earthly things, will return to God their origin. And then again animus, and again anima. The same inconsistency rules in the epitome of the divine institutions, supposed to have been written somewhere between 315–321. After having argued for the immortality of the soul, animus, with the help of Plato, cited by Cicero, Lactantius comes back to anima, a previous reference. This is remarkable in the opinion of Michel Perrin, the editor and translator of this work in the Sources Chrétiennes collection. Back to the second book of the Divine Institutions, at a moment Lactantius writes against people who were worshipping idols, and states that these are only bodies deprived of their humanity, corpora carentia hominibus, because they have given themselves to corporeal things and do not see anything with the mind, mente, more than with the body. Whereas it is the office of the soul, officium animi, to perceive those things more clearly which the eye of the body cannot behold. Thus, in his view, what makes a person a human being are not corporeal elements, as the eyes, the body being an envelope, a receptacle of man, but the soul. A. Cleveland Coxe, the annotator of the English translation, suggests that this perspective is not a theological, but merely a rhetoric one. It may be, but remarkable is the fact that Lactantius uses both mens and animus in the same fragment with reference to the same component of the human being, which is the soul. Still, in another fragment, referring to a false etymology of the Greek word anthropos, which he relates to the adverb ano, upwards, Lactantius argues that it is not the eyes of the body which are meant by the will of God, who created mankind with this characteristic, but the soul. It is most incorrect that the nature of the body, which is temporary, should be upright, whereas the soul itself, which is eternal, should be abject, as the figure and position have no other signification, except that the mind of man ought to look in the same direction as his countenance, and that his soul ought to be as upright as his body, so that it may imitate that which it ought to rule. Here it isn't clear whether Lactantius has in mind different meanings of mens and animus. Maybe the former is a part of the latter, or maybe it is only a rhetoric figure, as probably in many other cases. Nevertheless, in a fragment where he speaks of torments inflicted by demons to human beings, Lactantius does make a clear difference between souls and minds simply by the nature of the afflictions. And these, since evil spirits are without substance and not to be grasped, insinuate themselves into the bodies of men, and secretly working in their inward parts, they corrupt the health, hasten diseases, terrify their souls with dreams, harass their minds with frenzies, that by these evils they may compel men to have recourse to their aid. Now this final fragment we saw brought me to a very simple and common idea. What if Lactantius uses different words with more than one meaning? We tend very often to see terminology in a technical perspective, forgetting the fact that terminology is part of the vivid language of a person. Thus, if we accept that in modern languages words like soul, mind or heart can be used in various meanings, consciously or not, sometimes stuck in idiomatic expressions which make the words overlap one another, then we should accept the same possibility for a Christian writer like Lactantius. In this respect, he could use mens with reference to intellectual faculties, alternatively with mens referring to the soul, and deeper than that, referring to the heart and its deeper part, which corresponds to the Greek philocalic nous. I am not claiming that Lactantius uses consciously this range of meanings, especially when we saw his inconsistency in the use of different words concerning the soul without a clear picture of the reality indicated or described. But even this unclearness and this ambiguity show first a plurality of meanings, second, a possible reflection of what we later called a philocalic perspective on mind, nous. And since we wrongly tend to consider as philocalic only the Greek features of a certain late corpus of patristic texts, I should add that within Eastern Christian spirituality, a philocalic perspective goes far before the age of the first writers, and the philocalic thought goes beyond language and cultural borders. It is rather related to the watchfulness of the mind or of the soul in the contemplation of God. I have seen this perspective in St. Gregory the Great's sermons and Gospels. Maybe we should start considering a re-evaluation of the Latin anthropological terminology concerning the soul, bearing in mind this possible development of Latin under the same frame of mind the Greek Neptic fathers perceived and understood the notions of soul and mind. In this endeavor, maybe we should remind ourselves the words of Lactantius himself. The seat of wisdom is not the tongue, but the heart, and it makes no difference what kind of language we employ, for the question is not about words, but facts. Thank you for watching.